I'm Katie McLaughlin. It's exciting to be back on the podcast. So thanks for having me again, Brendan. Um, I am a team health coach, facilitator, consultant, and through my business, McLaughlin Method, I'm working to help create happier, healthier teams so that way we can do our best work at work and then bring our best selves, our energy back into our families and create healthier communities overall. And last time I was on the podcast, we, talked about this overarching theme around culture. And while that is still my end goal is creating these like happy, engaged cultures, I've recognized that as things have changed in the work landscape, many of us are going back to work. There's been layoffs and hiring, and there's been so much happening that teams are really becoming more and more the focus within an organization that you may not even know what's going on in other parts of the organization, but you're with your team all the time. And especially for leaders, your team is often the one place where you can have the most control and the most influence. So I love working with a group and especially working with a team and helping them to connect over some shared experiential learning experiences, whether that's team building, building very kind of specific skills along the lines of like feedback or persuasive communication, and all the way through to like conflict resolution interventions. And so to help kind of get leaders thinking about, what does my team need? How are we doing these days? I created the What's My Team Health Score quiz. And it's a super fast quiz. On average, it takes people 3 to 4 minutes to complete it. And from there, you get an initial score of good, bad, okay, uh, and probably very good. It's rare that I think everybody has gotten either a bad or an okay. But overall, my goal is to give people some insights of like, what are some of these things that I need to be paying attention to as a leader or even just on my team? Why aren't these things happening? It's probably pretty obvious while you're taking it, which things are probably good and which things are bad. But yeah, I know we're going to probably dig into that a little more and talk through like why they're important.
And obviously this overarching theme, since we last spoke, COVID became a thing. A lot of people were working remotely mainly. And because of such a large time frame, it was the case. I'm assuming a lot of managers now may have never actually managed in person before or actually managed a real team. Because a lot of time it was desynchronized. A lot of organizations, in my experience, didn't do a great job at managing remotely just because they thought COVID was a short thing. We don't have to invest in team component. We don't have to invest in training. Now in person, a lot of things are changing and happening. Are you finding, especially when these questions are coming up, is it just due to the fact that maybe there's a lot of new managers who've never dealt with this before? Is it just because it was a skill that was maybe not reinforced because a lot of it was done remote? Why do you think it's becoming, even on my side, talking to other leaders, it's a very popular thing right now? Why do you think it's more maybe prevalent now than maybe it wasn't so much maybe in the past, or has it always been the case, but now it's more top of mind because layoffs and turnover is such at an all-time high?
Right. Well, it has been even since before COVID that 60% of managers have never had a single bit of manager training.
Mm-hmm.
And if out of those 40% who have, I almost guarantee that the majority of that or more has been on technical things, like how to use our performance management system, how to approve someone's PTO, right? How to what's our process for hiring and what's our process for firing? Not even how to interview someone, or even like how to give the bad news or conduct an improvement plan kind of meeting. And so those skills weren't there. And then they definitely weren't there in the pandemic in a different way, like in terms of remote leadership. And it's why we saw a lot of tools starting to pop up around virtual monitoring of, what is employee focusing on, and where's their mouse, and, trying to prove people were working, right? And it's just, it has been a very difficult time for all of us. And we still bear the burden emotionally and mentally, really, from the pandemic, and now trying to figure out how do I do this thing again? Especially for those people who are going back in person, whether it's like all the time, hybrid, or just for the kind of those togetherness related
Yeah.
events, right? I am seeing more and more folks trying to do some of those kind of team togetherness events, fly people in. But for many of them, it's for like flying them in for a longer period of time, but once a year, as opposed to pre-COVID, we saw people flying in a lot, and maybe for a few days. So,
And what you touched on is kind of really interesting. Even what I've seen with the teams I've worked with, I think obviously, as we know, people don't leave bad companies, leave bad managers. And I've always heard this within leadership. It's that when things are good, you don't really have to be a good leader because everyone's happy. Like if everyone's making
mm-hmm.
money, work life is great, a manager doesn't really matter. I've had many managers where I've almost never spoke to them. But when there's a downturn, when there's more stress, you typically end
Mm-hmm.
up speaking with your manager more, and they, I believe, play a bigger role because there's uncertainty. And one big thing I always found with effective managers is that being as clear as possible, because uncertainty 9 out of 10 times is worse than the answer. So really being able to manage that, like fear, I would almost say, and that
Right.
stress when instead of working on your job, you're worrying, oh my goodness, do I have to start applying now? What's going on? So it's
Mm-hmm.
always that extreme stress. Do you, this is always a question I always hear, and everyone always likes to complain about the other generation. Do you find this generational at all, from like younger managers versus more tenured managers? Or is the problem everyone's facing equally? People just like to always find an excuse, but it's really human nature that we need to develop these skills that they haven't been trained before.
I'd say it's 100% generation, age, industry agnostic,
Mhm,
where we have not had a good culture at
mhm,
work about developing real skills. And, you know, I've met lots of folks who have gone through all of these different programs to get certified, say, like in project management
mhm,
skills, or, you've got some fancy, flashy letters after your name because of a
mhm,
graduate degree, and they have no actual practical experience and no skills being built.
mhm,
And so it's as if, just
mhm,
despite they have those letters after their name, we assume that means people know something, right? We also might assume that because so and so knows somebody else, that they are vouching for the fact
mhm,
that they know what they're doing. And in reality, we've just all been kind of bumbling around trying to figure out how to relate to each other at work. And the biggest thing that is happening right now is that both the millennial generation, of which I'm a part
mhm,
of, and everyone after us is making more inroads around requiring some sense of belonging, inclusion, purpose, meaning, whatever that means
mhm,
to people. And that could be all manner of like a range. That could be people being like, I want to have a lot of my identity be invested in my work and be doing really meaningful work. Whereas for other folks, it might even just be that I want to be treated fairly at work, and then be able to separate from work and go home and be with my family, be with the people that I care
mhm,
about, and do other things. And there's nothing wrong with that whole spectrum. Um, but the thing that we haven't grasped a handle on really is that it's not just business, it's not just work. We bring all of our crap, for all of our baggage, right? We've got cartloads of baggage and luggage
mhm,
that we bring with us into every relationship,
mhm,
every working team. And a lot of that comes from our past
mhm,
experiences with good managers, with bad managers. um, I could go on and on
mhm,
about all the stuff we bring in, but all of that influences how we interact with each other, the stories we start to create in our minds of, hey, my leader doesn't talk to me. For me, I always hated that. People would be like,
mhm,
"Oh, Katie got this," and I'm like, "Well, but I like collaborating, and I also would still like to know, am I doing a good job?" Whereas some people take the, like, just stay out of my hair. That
mhm.
means I'm doing a good job, right? But for me, that caused a lot of uncertainty for me. So everybody is a little bit different in terms of how we're going to respond to the way other people act and interact in the workplace.
And kind of touching on that as well, because everyone's different. Some people like more hands-on managers versus hands-off managers. How is there consistency though on like what is a good manager? I'm assuming there is, because obviously there's
Hmm.
like personal tie. Like some people, I know managers who ask for an update every week or just beginning of the week. I just want a list. Don't need to talk to you if you don't want to talk. Where do you think that skill set is? Because obviously you spoke to managers who said, "Hey, it's not my job to babysit you. You're an adult." But I had other managers who said, "Hey, I'm here to coach and mentor you through this process." So is it just a difference in preference, but there's still these core skills, or is it like you need a good fit between employee and manager style? Kind of how's that mess of life fit well together?
There's definitely no one way
Mhm,
that someone can lead correctly or well. And I would agree, it's really more that latter condition that you were describing,
mhm,
where it's about the overall relationship between a leader and their employees and vice versa. That every single person on your team is going to need something slightly different. And you may or may not be the best leader for them. But the way that you're going to find that out, first and foremost, is by engaging with them. And engaging with them, being connected and at least aware of what they're doing or who they are as a person, isn't the same thing as babysitting somebody,
mhm,
right? And I think that like it bothers me that we're still like thinking that way,
yeah.
right? That that if we have any kind of direction that I'm giving someone, right? Or parameters, for
Mhm,
example, right? We've got almost everything we do at work has some kind of parameters, right? There's
mhm,
some goalposts, there's some, you know, gutters, right? Like,
mhm,
and borders. But if we don't know what those are, how do we know what we even need to be creating,
mhm,
right? So for some people, though, they just assume, yeah, just leave me alone, don't talk to me. But they might not have the information that they need. So it really needs to be this conversation, this kind of dance between a manager and their team.
mhm. One of the last organization I worked at probably had the best. I had the best experience with that. Where when you got hired, the manager had a little bit about me and was like, "This is how I like
Hmm.
to manage. These are some of the weaknesses I'm aware of. Like sometimes I assume everyone understands what's going on. So if I'm doing that, please let me know. To hey, can you explain what's going on?"
Wow.
And then from the employee side, it was the same thing of like pretty general, but like, hey, like, what do you enjoy? What A or B? The not literally chocolate and vanilla, but like, do you like more hands on, more kind of letting you figure out? And I found that very effective because when you join a new team, it's like anything in life. There's that awkward introduction where you're trying to figure each other out, but it just helped have that conversation where like, hey,
Mm.
this is how my style is. If your style is different, we can find that happy middle ground. And I do believe that even if you had two different dramatically different people. You may not be the best manager for someone, but typically you can be a good enough manager to help them do
Mhm.
the role effectively, and then maybe have a mentor outside who can better fit their needs. But I think there's always I always find that someone's an excuse like, oh, no, I'm such a hands off manager. But I always feel as a manager
Mm.
also, you have to almost put more effort in because they're reporting up to you, even though it is a even street a lot of times with that open and honest communication. As a manager, take on that responsibility to maybe have a little bit more of a breadth of leadership style,
Mm.
especially if that's your main goal. Do you I always this is always a thing, and funny enough, this topic I got into fights not literally, but not literally either. It was during my MBA class where the students were arguing with the professor. It was a hectic class by far, but a lot of times you hear like conflict is bad or conflict sometimes can be good.
Mm.
How do you know what is healthy conflict for a growing business where you need to have some disagreements because groupthink is poisonous versus a conflict that is someone will say, "Oh, you just have to be tough here," but in reality, you're just causing a lot of mistrust or causing those kind of foundational cracks. How do you differentiate between that, or is it just, yeah? I guess that's the question. How can you differentiate between good conflict, or maybe there's a better word for that, versus that bad conflict that maybe you find for 3 months, but then 6 months, a year, you have a team that disbands or a company starts falling apart.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that because it's been on my mind.
Mhm,
Uh, Someone close to me was on a team with a leader where their leader wanted absolutely no conflict. And this is just really unrealistic. And like you said, groupthink is a problem. I actually co-teach an MBA class about creative decision making. And one of the things we look at is about the notion of like, how do we make decisions? And when we have kind of a really homogenous group of either thinkers, people of the same identity, et cetera, we're less likely to actually take risks, and we're more likely to just believe what other people are saying. And that's not necessarily the right way to do something, right? And so when we have these more diverse viewpoints, we are forced to communicate clearer because we're going to communicate in different ways, and usually helps us to find flaws or gaps or holes in an argument, or at least even bolster a particular argument or perspective, say on a product or a decision we should make. So I would kind of refer to it as like healthy conflict or productive conflict. And you've gone the wrong way when it becomes unproductive, when you're just yelling at each other, or when, someone, for example, exhibits some kind of behavior. So that we've got yelling, or there could also be shutting down. So either of those types of very strong emotions, very strong reactions is a sign of unproductive conflict, because the goal of any kind of conflict is to resolve it, to get to a place where you're actually coming together and leaning in to the team, to the relationship, and wanting it to continue.
Yeah.
Right. And lots of workplace conflict can really create a strong dividing line between people. Common situations that I see that aren't great include someone kind of just completely shutting down someone else's opinion or offering, often, especially when it comes into like a hierarchy situation where there might be a leader or even, a leader's leader coming in and kind of saying, case closed, let's move on. And the reality is, again, we all actually want to feel valued for our contributions, and if nothing else, for our experience. We all have tons of life and lived and worked experience to draw upon. And so, it's really important that that doesn't just get completely shut down.
I think that's a lot of things. I think there's always that, like I always had managers that said, maybe, hey, you might have an opinion and maybe won't go with your opinion because other people have different opinions and I'm the leader, I have to make the decision. But there's always an ability to at least speak your mind and say, this is my thoughts. And then having that conversation. I think one thing I've always found with, especially when there's a hierarchy, even if you're, more junior, you might have the completely wrong opinion, at least listening to it, taking into consideration, saying, hey, because X, Y, and Z, I don't know if it's going to fit, we're going this direction, but this, like, we heard you. And I found a lot of times on the note-taking side of things as well, just being able to give your 2 cents. But again, I think it's one of those challenging things of having an open and honest, I always attack the problem, not the person. It always sounds so simple, but a lot of times, as you know, your personality is very tied to your opinions as well. So it's very hard to like completely separate that. But yeah, it's always an interesting thing of like being able to have that healthy conflict. I've also found the best way I've found also is like having time frames for things. Like, hey, we're talking about this topic for 10 minutes. After that, we can continue the conversation. We have to switch to a new topic because after a while, it's like you're back and forth over this minute thing. So it is an interesting thing. I think more and more the idea of, like you said, constructive conflict, having those conversations and really trying to find core main goal. Are we going towards the goal? If not,
Yes.
we're off track. And kind of having someone in the room at least, or everyone aware that if this is occurring, we need to pivot or do something else.
Right. Yeah. I love what you're saying about about the ability to share ideas, and that then the next step being, here's why we went with this. Right. And, that's a huge component that is usually not happening. I mean, a lot of folks aren't bringing any other opinions into the conversation. So that's, problem number one. But if you are doing that and you're not then explaining how did we arrive at this decision, or, kind of what's motivating
Mhm.
our approach here, why did we not go with other
Mhm.
situations, etc. uh, People might get this opinion that like, well, yeah, you maybe you heard us, but
Mhm.
you already had your mind
Yeah.
made up, right? And people just want to feel heard. And so if you explain why you went in a particular direction, then that can often help them understand your thought process. It builds trust as well. And really just helps everybody to feel
Mhm.
part of that decision, even if they weren't actually the ones making it.
Mhm. I've always found very effective if you had, when a decision was made, like a list of assumptions, like we made this decision based on
Mm.
these three core pillars. If these are wrong, we know the decision's wrong, but this is kind of the thought process we had. And I've always found that, like you're saying, very effective, because even if you're like, I don't think you're right, I can at least understand your thought process. We might have different interpretations of what the data meant, but I understand that this decision, like you said, wasn't just your opinion. There was some
Right.
thought making you feel a bit better about kind of the direction your team's going overall.
Yeah.
I always Do you find that, obviously, when we talk about these team building, kind of developing that team building, they always go back to these trust falls. It's always trust falls. I think I've only done trust fall in school. I don't think I've ever done it in a really corporate setting, but everyone thinks of that. Obviously,
Yes.
at the time when those were probably popular back when, years ago, things have changed. They became normalized and things have adapted. Where do you think people maybe get misinterpretation of what team building is versus what it actually
Mhm.
is? Because you can, depending, some teams love it because they're probably good. It's like a manager. People have great experience, they love it. Some, like you said, someone just does it. They do some trust falls, not really working on anything. How? I
Mhm.
guess the question is here is, what is the work really focused on, and maybe what are some of the misconceptions when you're speaking to individuals who maybe had negative experiences in the past that are just not true in this line of work?
I've definitely had those bad experiences again back in school,
Mhm.
of being told we needed to do a ropes course, or
Mhm. The ropes course every time.
everybody we
Yeah.
had to figure out how to get everybody, this entire team, over this obstacle, right, by
Mhm.
like lifting them all, and
Mhm.
that's just really uncomfortable. And I'm glad that for the most part
Mhm.
we've graduated past that and realized there's a lot
Yeah.
of consent issues with something like that. Um, but you know, because we all seem to have that like cultural that culture of like place in our
Mhm.
brains, right, when we think of team building, of that. And in reality, if we get back to the goals of team building, and
Mhm.
even those trust falls, obstacle
Mhm.
courses, etc., um, one of the primary goals of that is trust, and to build trust. But you can only build trust in a safe environment.
Mhm.
And for many people, I know myself, didn't feel very safe in that kind of environment, but we're forced to do it. And so, team building, in some ways, people have said, oh, I hate team building. And so let's just do a happy hour,
Mhm.
or, let's get people together and we'll throw a party. And that's fun. It can be fun for a lot of people, but many people still don't feel
Mhm.
comfortable in that space. And there's really nothing facilitating some kind of trust building, facilitating making connections with people beyond your typical people that you like to relate to on the team.
Mhm.
Because it's not enough to say, like, I love working with you. And so
Mhm.
when we go to the after work happy hour, we're going to hang out and maybe talk to a couple other people that we know, but we're never going to talk to those people who we don't actually like working with.
Mhm.
Right. And so, that's one of the main reasons why
Mhm.
doing a happy hour, or just doing an event without any intentional trust building activities or communication collaboration
Mhm.
activities, just not going to it's not going to get your goals met. And so the way that effective team building is
Mhm.
happening is through those intentional activities. And what I do in my work with organizations is bring in theater components, highly interactive, and I do this both in
Mhm.
person as well as virtually, to get people to have some fun with each other, and then explore things like, kind of really what is that culture of our team, and what are some things we're always doing but maybe we don't like doing as a team. We can start to reveal, hey, you know, half of us really don't like participating in brainstorming sessions, and we do that through some different theater exercises that I do with folks, and we help to identify, well, if we want people to have their voices heard, what are kind of some of those guardrails we can put in place, like we were talking about
Mhm.
before, of allowing people to feel heard, to contribute,
Mhm.
and then have that, close that loop later. So yeah, it's just really important that that team building has a purpose, has an intention, and has deliberate activities that are going to be leading to building trust and connection.
And one thing that's kind of always interesting, I've been hearing more and more, obviously, as I'm expecting a kid soon. I always hear like you should kind of connect this. You should be a parent. You should be a parent, not a friend to your kid. Is like, I guess, this
Mm,
line of thinking. But I've also heard on the manager side heavily that your manager should always be a manager and not your best friend to some extent. And there's,
mm,
I guess, reasons for that. So how do you balance the fact of like trying to be, I think this is something probably I've seen more newer managers have this thing where you're always trying to be best friends with all your employees, but a lot of times that might not just not feel comfortable, like, hey,
mhm.
I don't want to be best friends with my manager because it's just a weird dynamic, or you're maybe very outgoing, I'm very introverted. How do you I guess develop that professional level of trust where it's obviously, I had someone who are very friendly, want to do everything together, but obviously kind of build those, like you said, I guess build those boundaries. Is that a real issue, or is it more of those one-offs where maybe some people are more outgoing and want that deeper, like,
Mm,
we're family here, is common? I've also worked with teams where it's actually phenomenal. They are like family, went to each other's weddings, but how do you kind of build that in where maybe you have a manager who's super activity focused, but that may not be the
mm,
appropriate culture, in the sense that maybe some other team members want to go home and not have to go to a happy hour every week. Which I've also been on that front where it's like every Wednesday they
mhm,
go out, and I'm like, this is too much. This is all the time. So kind of how have you been able to balance that out? Because obviously it's a personal preference, but also when you have a team
mhm.
of very diverse people, you kind of want to have many different ways people can collaborate, not that, like you said, that happy hour only as the option.
Right. Yeah. And that's the perfect correlation that you just made. You've
Mhm.
got people that have diverse interests, backgrounds, experience, and things they like to
Mhm.
do. And why limit the possible ways
Mhm.
that you could connect down into one thing? And
Mhm.
one of the ways that we're actually kind of hampered in in that realm is that our brains, the way that they work, is that they're trying to find us the
Mhm.
most comfortable,
Mhm.
easiest path.
Mhm.
And so when we think we found something that works, say a happy hour,
Mhm.
or things like saying we're a family
Mhm.
at work to indicate we care about our
Mhm.
people, we just stick with it.
Mhm.
And that's not always the best thing. And I don't know about you, but pretty much every family I know has some kind of dysfunction, whether
Yeah.
that's open or openly discussed and
Mhm.
talked about or not.
Mhm.
So I actually really hate when companies say that we're a family, because
Mhm.
I was told that a lot by a lot of companies I worked with, and we were really dysfunctional.
Yeah.
um, but you know, it is important to create boundaries,
Mhm.
but as a leader, especially,
Mhm.
and one of the reasons for that is that at the end of the day, you are in a position of power over
Mhm.
the people that report to you, and you are going to have to make hard decisions sometimes. And when the lines are really blurred around what your relationship is with your team, it can make those hard conversations, those hard decisions, um, just much more difficult. And because you're in a position of power
Mhm.
over your employees, things can get into a dicey, emotional place,
Mhm.
uh, harassment, sexual
Mhm.
harassment, kind of avenue pretty quickly, especially when alcohol is involved.
Mhm.
And so, there is a certain amount of separation, and term like boundary really is the
Mhm.
best word to use. That said, you're still a human.
Mhm.
And if you have too strong of a boundary and try to kind of be too professional, maybe never share anything
Mhm.
about your life outside of work, um, you know, never laugh with your team,
Mhm.
then that just shows more of a kind of standoffish, less interested. Also can sometimes create like a fear type relationship with
Mhm.
your employees of who really is this person, and you know, what do they feel like
Mhm.
about me, about my team.
Mhm.
um, and so it is this interesting line to walk of making sure that you're spending time with your team, right? Like that's
Mhm.
first and foremost, whether that's at work, or potentially outside of work
Mhm.
at appropriate
Mhm.
events, but also that you are making sure that you're asking yourself, what is my relationship
Yeah.
with my team, and is that relationship in service to the team?
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. And one thing, well, one of the organizations I worked at to like help not counteract that, but they would have this thing where you'd have like a work buddy who would be another manager or someone above you in a different department. So if you're having like, hey, my manager, like they're doing, is this like not inappropriate in the sense of inappropriate, but like this is the direction they're going. How can I speak to them? How can we have that
Mm,
conversation? I always found like that work buddy that was someone else who was at your manager's level. I found it really effective because you had someone not shit talk, but be have that conversation with where it didn't have to be professional because they were in your
hmm
direct report, but you also had someone who maybe knew the organization better. But it's like, no, that's how we're going. This is the reason X, Y, and Z. So I think it is. I've had the good managers I've had. It is that layer of realizing, hey, I am your manager. We're going to set some professional
hmm
boundaries as well, and this is the thought process. But obviously, also one thing I found interesting with really good teams I've been a part of is having different ways of having those communications. So I had one where it's like you had the happy hour, but you also had like lunch and learn with like board games, and
hmm
you also had like, so there was different ways, and
yeah.
it was great because everyone was out of their comfort zone in one of these scenarios, but allowed almost
Mm,
98% of the time, someone had an element they were great at. So if even it was like a small
right.
talent show they had to do or karaoke, it was just some of these other things where some people hated it, but you're like, hey, I hate this, but I've done other things I love. So now we're all kind of getting used to everyone's world. And I found those effective where team members also kind of had to take control of the situation and say, hey, this is what I want to do. We're trying it. And again, it is an I think like you said, I think thing you touched on that really spoke to me was the fact that what worked in the past might not currently be the best method as teams
hmm
change, organization changes. If you get too used to something, you're also not
hmm
expanding your boundaries. So I think having that, taking a step back and reevaluating, hey, is there a better, more effective way of doing this team building and
hmm
developing this strong culture? And is it getting stale? Because like many things in life, sometimes you just have to change because I've worked at companies where everyone was 25 and now they're 40. So
right.
obviously there's different life experiences. So kind of having that realization that you have to kind of
hmm
change with time as well. When you're working with teams and having these conversations and doing these programs, what do you think, especially now, is there something that is more, obviously because you've done this for a while, is there something more common now in 2024 that is wasn't as common in the past, or is there some like thread of continuality between all the challenges people are facing, or is it really much the same challenges over kind of repeating themselves, or there
Mm-hmm.
is or is there something not new but something that's more consistent now that maybe people have gotten used to, or because things are changing weren't as aware of it being a big problem that currently is?
Hmm. You know, for the most part, I'd say that like the problems are generally consistent, especially if people haven't really been investing in some of these
Mhm.
like intentional team building, trust building,
Mhm.
skill building, situations. And it's really um, those teams that have been taking that time, who are making
Mhm.
some of those investments, even some of these companies that I'm hearing you describe, which sound like great places to work,
Mhm.
actually, based off of your
Mhm.
descriptions. Um, Once you're kind of at a certain place, that is really kind of where things can change and you can find nuance, because you're right,
Mhm.
it can get stale and you still have to be investing in your
Mhm.
team and your culture. And then it's really about the goals that you have
Mhm.
as an organization. So, you might be doing great as a team, you have fun
Mhm.
together, you collaborate well, but maybe you're not as productive as you could be, or you know the only constant is change, right? And so maybe your team is about to face a really big like reorganization,
Mhm.
or you're going to be asked to pivot and work on something completely different, or work in a very different way than you were
Mhm.
used to. That's usually the biggest impetus that I'm seeing, that is a consistent need for some kind of team workshop engagement, what have you. So
Mhm.
it may not be at that time kind of team building, but then maybe we've got really specific skills we need to work on, and that
Mhm.
can also be, how do we navigate change and how do we react to change? Because if we don't know of how we react to something, we
Mhm.
can't change how we act in
Yeah.
some way. And so that's a lot of what we talk about and work on it in my workshops, is
Mhm.
being aware of just what is that reaction for me to these
Mhm.
variety of different circumstances. So that way I can decide, is that how I want to react? Or
Mhm.
do I actually want to act in a different way? And so what's it going to take for me to be able to do that?
Mhm. What's unique here is obviously when we're talking about teams, it's everyone, the employees, the managers, kind of a whole team. I've been in a situation in the past where I'd always blame the manager for everything, being like, "Oh, it's the manager's fault." Not realizing me as the employee, I have some work to do here as well. It is a two-way street to some extent. How often, when you're kind of working with individuals, is it on the employee versus the manager? Because there is some extent kind of having to do both. How do you, I guess, thread that line where it's, I
Mm.
can't think of a good way of saying this, but before it's like better way of saying this, but it's like, when is a me problem in your view, when people have to
Mm.
maybe take a step back personally and realize, hey, the team is trying to do things. Maybe I'm being closed off, or I'm not being, I hate using like a good employee, but like in anything in life, like a good partner or a good
Mm.
son or child, like when that, can you self-reflect a little bit and realize maybe I need to do some work to help others also be a part of this team component and the culture they're trying to develop?
Mm. Well, I mean, first and foremost, nobody likes to be singled out and be
Mhm.
told, hey, you're the one that needs to change. Uh, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this, the whole idea that, like, if you point a finger at somebody,
Mhm.
there's three more fingers pointing back at
Yeah.
you. Right. And it's not usually ever effective for anybody to be called out and saying,
Mhm.
to be told you're the problem.
Yeah.
Because our immediate reaction is going to be defensive,
Yeah.
and that's not a place from which we can take
Mhm.
intentional, supportive of a
Mhm.
relationship kind of
Mhm.
action. And so the only thing that we can
Mhm.
control is ourselves,
Mhm.
and we maybe can influence other
Mhm.
people, but we can't actually control what they
Mhm.
think or what they're going to do about something. And so sometimes, especially in business, we have to accept that not everybody is going to be willing to do that
Mhm.
work to see that they're the ones that have to change.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
one of the things that is part of why I do what I
Mhm.
do, in working with teams, is that I don't put anybody on a spot.
Mhm.
Everybody's responding to the same like prompts, and yes, we do also
Mhm.
have some discussions, but especially the like theater related
Mhm.
activities and components that I do, where people might be afraid of
Mhm.
putting themselves out
Mhm.
there and think they have to perform. Everybody's doing it at the same time and showing their kind of unvarnished
Mhm.
reaction, to something. And many times it can be almost enough for somebody to recognize, hey, my reaction is very different from the
Mhm.
majority of people on my team. And having that opportunity to see that can give them this first big moment of, why is that? Right.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, we also can't force people to change, either. And so that's why people are messy, right? Teams are messy.
Mhm.
And if we want to think that there's a recipe for success, or a playbook, um it's different for everybody, and there's
Mhm.
a million different tools that you can use and approaches, and
Mhm.
it's ultimately, there's just as many ways that that's good and bad for every different relationship.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. The one bit I found with going in person more is seeing
Mm.
how other people are working and reacting, just to realize,
Yeah.
oh, am I on par? Is this something similar? How are people having calls? Just this The only thing I've seen from kind of virtual, where you're maybe on your own little bubble at your desk, is you're not getting the ability to human nature to compare yourself to others to see, hey, when I'm
Mm-hmm.
taking these phone calls, when I'm doing, especially in sales, when I'm doing the demo, how am I speaking compared to someone else? Okay, am I being more aggressive? Okay, this is kind of just some learnings that's very hard to self-reflect on when you don't
Yeah.
realize there's other ways of doing things. I think that's one of the benefits of in person. Although traffic sucks, I'm not saying only go in person, but it is one thing that is, you can't argue, is more effective, seeing, like you said, seeing others do something and realizing how you are reacting maybe differently than others.
Mhm. I'll add to that that it is just as important for um, leaders to be observed by their team, interacting with people in a variety of different ways. So, if we're all at home in our own little bubbles and
Mhm,
all you're seeing is your leader on either your one on ones or
mhm,
your team meetings or their random messages on, Slack or Teams or what have you, you have such a narrow view into who that person is. And to you, it might seem like they're just way overreacting to something
mhm,
uh, because that's how you're interpreting it. And you're not seeing, hey, this is just kind of how they maybe ask that question, like to get a
mhm.
status update, for example. This is how they ask that question to everybody.
Yeah.
Um, and, when you see somebody like in in the real world on repeat acting a similar way, saying something in a similar way, you can start to form a better opinion and picture of who that person is,
Mhm,
instead of this kind of amorphous, like blurry image that I think many of us have of both our leaders and our teams because of working remotely for so long.
mhm. I think that kind of ties everything together very well. The idea that you can't really change people. You can hopefully help them see themselves better, but also realizing that figuring out how people react, how people talk, just so you're able to understand, is this something they always do? Is this normal? Are Am I doing something wrong? Kind of where is this reaction? Because you always have managers who love to message you saying, hey, do you have a quick minute to talk? Always think you're getting fired. But for some people, they're just sporadic. They're okay, quick 5 minutes on an update, and you don't have to freak out. Where others, when you get that email, something's, it's just like anything in life, just understanding how to have those interactions, especially why these team building workshops are so important, is because understanding how people are interacting, how they are personality wise, just so you have a better understanding how you yourself can work better with that individual.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we're wrapping up now, I guess kind of end off here. If you're a manager or even an employee, what are some of the things you can look for? Obviously, that we can speak, you can talk about the survey a bit, because I went through it. It was amazing, kind of bringing to light certain topics so you realize, oh, this is a not a red flag, but this is some signs or some things to consider. But what are maybe some of those key things to keep top of mind when you're thinking of team building, thinking of being a new manager, maybe that really help you have a better baseline of growth and developing a culture that maybe didn't exist in your organization prior?
Yeah, a couple of things that appear kind of again in this quiz that I've got is something like I ask people to respond to whether or not your
Mhm,
team openly asks for help.
mhm,
So, why do I ask that question? Well, the ability to ask for help is usually a sign of how comfortable someone feels with the group, with you as a leader, and their willingness to show that they don't know everything. And
mhm,
we have this general opinion that if you ask for help, it means that you can't do something
mhm,
or you don't know something, and that makes you bad. And so when you openly ask for help or support, or help can also look like, hey, has anyone seen this before?
mhm,
Or I'd love to bounce some ideas off of somebody. All of that is a way that like someone could be asking for help.
mhm,
That's all very healthy for a team culture because you're connecting with each other. You're getting a chance again to share that expertise, and it helps you grow your team of skills too that everyone has because we can't be experts at everything.
mhm,
Um, you know, Something that was really common for me, and I see this a lot,
mhm,
is you've got two or more people who just cannot work together. Now, not everybody has to be friends,
mhm,
uh, but can become a really big challenge if you've got people who you can't pair together at all.
mhm,
Um, by itself isn't necessarily a huge problem, but it does indicate something that like is likely to fester and can become an issue that spreads, right?
Hmm.
Because okay, well, I don't really like working with this person, so I'm going to go tell this other person and complain about them.
Hmm.
And then it starts to, pervade itself into other relationships. And so, at the end of the day, as a leader, you can't just say everybody has to work together and everybody has to work with everybody.
Hmm.
You have to notice, hey, this is happening. And then it's time to start investigating. Why is
Hmm.
this happening? Do you also have a similar challenging relationship with those people? What do you know about the problem, and how can you start to build in some interventions into that? They don't, again, you're never going to make them best friends if they
Hmm.
really don't like working together and they
Hmm.
have past conflict, but you can get it to a place so they can be productive together, or figure out where they can work together well and where they
Hmm.
can't.
I think that's great. I think it's realizing that not everyone will be friends, but if you can't work together at all, that is just not doable in a workplace where you have to work together. It's one of those things where maybe in the real world, like you don't like someone, just don't talk to them. But in an office, you have to at least be able to respect. I think the key is like respect one another, to say if they make a decision, I respect them enough or believe in them enough that I understand why they're doing it and I can take it and just kind of go, versus just having like, oh, anything that person says I don't like. Because like you touched on, maybe that conflict isn't bad, but you start not gossiping, but talking, having a confidant, and then they will look at that person differently, and then it kind of, like you said, it spreads very quickly before you know it
Mm-hmm.
too much. And I've seen that
Right.
happen many times, even from teams I've been a part of, in organizations that started kind of going down that slippery slope of like culture degression almost.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, a lot of topics we touched on today. If people want to learn more, kind of get in contact with you, what's the best place, and kind of learn a bit more about this whole world of making culture a little more effective and teams the best versions of themselves?
Well, in general, you can reach me on my website, mclaughlinmethod.com. If you're interested in this quiz we talked about today, teamhealthscorequiz.com is where you can find it. And after you've taken it, you get an opportunity to schedule a free 30-minute consult with me, where I'll pull up your scores and we'll talk about some of those specific things that you've got going on, and get you some insights into what's happening. But you can also follow me on LinkedIn, and all of my podcast episodes, guesting on other people's podcasts like this, are part of a Spotify playlist as well that's on my website.